Mathew, Shelley, and we'll look forward to hearing about the Air Museum, the RAAF Air Museum, of course, at Point Cook, and the developments there as well. Mathew, welcome aboard.
Thank you very much.
Main one.
Yep. Now we're just going to get things set up here. So first of all, Matthew, do you want to pin that on? And I'll put your presentation up. Okay, can I just check on the call? Can people see the screen, the title slide, Australia's Air Force Museum?
Yes, we can see.
Brilliant. And I'm going to mute everybody so that if you want to speak or ask a question, you'll need to unmute yourself. Without interruptions during the call. It's going to mute everybody. The controls. Find that control. So I'll just ask everybody to mute themselves, please.
Someone has muting. Someone hasn't. Speak up to anyone.
See if I can get the meeting controls back. There they are up there.
So long as Group Captain Fredericks is muted, he's the one who asks the tricky questions.
Oh no, he's first to be muted.
I heard that.
Didn't you mute him?
There will be a test for you all later.
All right, so just use the forward.
Yeah, no worries at all.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, good evening. And thank you very much for inviting me along to speak with you this evening. I'd like to begin with an important caveat. I'm not a museum curator. I'm not an Air Force historian, and I'm certainly not an aviation historian. While the topic of my presentation this evening is Australia's Air Force Museum, a new vision for RAAF Museum, a more honest title might be, I'm a musician, get me out of here. But as an Air Force aviator, I'm part of a long lineage of people who take the resources and technology they are given and apply it to the problems they're trusted to solve and to the capabilities they're charged to deliver. So I trust that you'll listen to my words this evening in that context, and I hope that what I have to say offers some value to you. So I was posted to RAAF Museum at the peak of a tumultuous change effort. Before I arrived, RAAF Museum maintained and operated historical military aviation aircraft. RAAF Museum visitors were treated to frequent interactive flying displays on the oldest continually operating military airfield in the world and at the birthplace of both the Australian Flying Corps and the Royal Australian Air Force. Most visitors would, of course, attend the museum itself, but the star attraction was undoubtedly the interactive flying displays operated and managed by RAAF Museum personnel, including volunteers. When I was posted to RAAF Museum at the beginning of 2021, the responsibilities for maintaining and operating Air Force heritage aircraft passed to the newly formed 100 Squadron. The operating of flying displays ceased to be a RAAF Museum product. My initial mandate then was to pivot RAAF Museum staff and operations toward delivering a new visitor experience based solely upon static display aircraft and artifacts. And so we developed a new mission for RAAF Museum to advance the appreciation of Air Force history and heritage through the collection, preservation, restoration, interpretation, and exhibition of Air Force historical and cultural artifacts. RAAF Museum is not just about displaying aircraft. We collect aircraft, cultural artifacts, and historical Air Force artifacts. We preserve them, we restore them, we interpret them, and we exhibit them. We have around 100,000 catalogued items at RAAF Museum, as well as a large number of uncatalogued items. RAAF Museum manages the largest elements of the National Air Force Heritage Collection at RAAF Base Point Cook, with other elements on display and stored at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra and other Air Force Heritage Centres at RAAF Bases Amberley, Wagga, Williamtown and Townsville. RAAF Museum is part of Air Force's History and Heritage branch. The work of the branch is to collect, study, preserve and manage records, artefacts and estate from Australian Flying Corps to today's Air Force. While each of the Air Force Heritage Centres in RAAF bases Amberley, Wagga, Williamtown and Townsville are charged with displaying aircraft and artefacts representing their own local histories, RAAF Museum has the privileged mandate of displaying aircraft and artefacts representing the entire history of the Australian Flying Corps and Air Force. Fortunately, to pivot RAAF Museum toward delivering a new visitor experience based solely upon static display aircraft and artifacts, we had a very solid base from which to work. RAAF Museum was formed and established in 1952 and has been collecting aircraft and artifacts now for 70 years. The main exhibition complex of RAAF Museum was officially opened in 1996 as part of the RAAF's 75th anniversary celebrations and has undergone incremental upgrades to the present day. The strike and aircraft display hangars were established in 1993 as temporary aircraft displays and have not undergone any significant redevelopment since, with the exception of the addition of the F-111 Boneyard Wrangler in 2009. Now, although impressive in their own right, the strike and aircraft display hangars represent a diminishing experience for visitors relative to the more polished main exhibition complex. And so rather than just reopen RAAF Museum post-COVID-19, RAAF Museum embarked on a $4.3 million project to upgrade the strike and aircraft display hangars in order to create a new visitor experience, which is immersive, engaging, and understandable. Last time RAAF Museum was open to the public, the strike hangar was a Bellman hangar warehouse of Canberra Bomber, F-4 Phantom, and F-111 strike aircraft. In order to allow visitors to enter that space without supervision, a viewing platform with glass screens was situated in the corner of the hangar, allowing visitors to view these massive aircraft from a distance. Over the past few months, the roof of the strike hangar has been completely replaced and blacked out. The viewing platform and glass screens have been removed and the interior walls lined with black drapes to create an intimate and accessible theatre space. Historic footage is being gathered and new footage produced for each of the 3 aircraft. Production of 3 shows, 1 for each aircraft, will introduce visitors to the aircraft, the personnel who flew and maintained them, as well as some of the key events that have shaped the history of Australia and the world. The exhibition also supports the inclusion of an FA-18 Classic Hornet scheduled to arrive at RAAF Museum in May 2022. The new exhibition features theatrical lighting installations, graphic walls, and a large raised and sound-reinforced visitor platform between the aircraft, which will rumble as aircraft fly ahead on overhead projector screens. If you visited the G for George exhibit at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, think G for George ×3 and on steroids. That's what the new strike hangar experience is going to be like. The strike hangar will deliver a visitor experience that will bring to life these amazing aircraft with a focus on the Air Force personnel that took them to the skies. Now, the aircraft hangar was previously an open display warehouse of mixed aircraft, including Jindovic, Avro Cadet, Iroquois, Sabre, Sikorsky Dragonfly, Boomerang, Hawker Demon, DH-84 Dragon, and Cessna Bird Dog. All crammed within a Bellman hangar, this eclectic mix of aircraft were viewable at a distance from an elevated and caged walkway. Over the past months, the roof of the aircraft hangar has been completely replaced and blacked out to control lighting within the hangar, and the elevated walkway has been removed. The aircraft are being reset into a new and accessible configuration with the thematic framework of right tools for the job and Australian made. Visitors will be able to walk through the center of the hangar and explore each of the aircraft in close proximity. The new exhibition includes theatrical lighting installations, introduction and timeline graphics along the interior walls, backlit graphic lanterns containing interpretation and facts for each aircraft, and interactive touchscreens so visitors can learn and explore more content about each of the aircraft. Clear and accessible circulation, coupled with interactive content, will take visitors on a journey through the aircraft hangar that is engaging, dynamic, and understandable. This $4.3 million exhibition upgrade across 2 hangars, coupled with new exhibits and enhancements within the main exhibition complex, represents the extent of the RAAF Museum interim redevelopment project, which will allow RAAF Museum to open to the public in July 2022. July 2022 promises to be much more than the reopening for RAAF Museum. It will be a new visitor experience. Now, having said that, the physical redevelopment of the RAAF Museum is just the easy part. The security posture of RAAF Base Point Cook has changed markedly over the last years. It was only a few years ago that the security posture was more relaxed, and a visit to RAAF Museum was akin to a day on the lawns at RAAF Base Point Cook. Today, RAAF Base Point Cook is an active and secure defence airbase and is undergoing significant redevelopment. As one of the few defence air bases in Australia with air, land and sea approaches, the strategic importance of RAAF Base Point Cook is obvious. And so one of the first challenges we face with reopening the museum to the public is how to operate a publicly accessible museum from inside the wire of a secure defence base. And so we were having to implement some new base visitor access systems. When RAAF Museum reopens to the public in July 2022, visitors will be required to pre-book via an online booking system. On arrival at the base, visitors will be signed on by base security and escorted at all times through a system of trusted eyes. Visitor movements will be monitored around the RAAF Museum precinct, and visitors will not be able to access base areas beyond the RAAF Museum precinct. Now, there's a fine line between novelty and nuisance with such a system, which will require RAAF Museum to strike a fine balance between adhering to base security protocols and creating a welcoming and accessible visitor experience. But RAAF Base Point Cook is the appropriate location for RAAF Museum, being the birthplace of both the Australian Flying Corps and the Royal Australian Air Force. However, in order for RAAF Museum to be accessible to all Australians, there is a need to relocate RAAF Museum to a publicly accessible location outside the wire at RAAF Base Point Cook. Concepts for what a new RAAF Museum might look like on the northwest corner of Point Cook are being explored under the concept project RAAF Museum 2025. Now, before we consider what RAAF Museum 2025 might look like, I'd like to explore with you what it means to put an aircraft on display within a museum, as there are a number of important factors to consider. Firstly, which aircraft do we select for display and what is its significance? An aircraft might have representative significance as a reproduction of an aircraft type. For example, the RE8 at RAAF Museum has representative significance as a meticulously detailed reproduction of an early aircraft flown by the Australian Flying Corps. An aircraft might have referential significance as an example of an aircraft or capability type. For example, the C-130H at RAAF Museum has no particular provenance. It's just an excellent example of a C-130H operated by Air Force from 1978. However, an aircraft might also have iconic significance due to its unique provenance. For example, the F/A-18 Classic Hornet tail number 043, which is likely to arrive at RAAF Museum in May this year, has special and unique provenance due to its recent operational history overseas. So every aircraft on display at RAAF Museum carries with it varying degrees of representative, referential, or iconic significance, which affects decisions on how and where they might be displayed. So once we've decided upon the aircraft for display and have understood its significance, how is the aircraft prepared for display? There are a number of considerations relating to the preparation of an aircraft, but for tonight, let's just consider the paintwork and service finish. In some cases, we want to leave the paintwork completely untouched. For example, the FA-18 Classic Hornet 043, we want to preserve the paintwork in the condition that it left service. Why? Because its unique provenance is due to its recent operational history. We want to preserve the paintwork and markings to display it in the condition that it left service. In other cases, such as Black Hawk 101, which recently arrived at RAAF Museum, we want to completely repaint the aircraft. Why? Well, mostly because it says Army on the side of it, but also because its unique provenance is due to it being the first Black Hawk to enter service when they were flown by Air Force and operated by 9 Squadron before being transferred to Army. And so we want the Army markings removed and the aircraft repainted in 9 Squadron colours before we put this particular aircraft on display. We might also be tempted to apply protective coating to help preserve the aircraft, particularly those being parked outside. But while a high gloss coating might help preserve the surface of an aircraft, a high gloss finish to an aircraft like the P-3 Orion would hardly be considered an authentic finish. Now, these are all important considerations, and decisions around preparing an aircraft for display need to be carefully negotiated between those who collect the aircraft, those who restore and maintain the aircraft, and those who curate the displays. But let's assume we've gone through all of that we've selected an aircraft and prepared it for display. Let's also assume that our researchers have confirmed the historical facts relating to what we know about the aircraft's history, and that our curators have provided some text and imagery to accompany the display. Now, despite the representational or iconic significance inherent in any aircraft, the significance of an aircraft changes the moment it's put on display within a museum. Why? Because putting an aircraft on display into a museum, onto a pedestal and under lights for people to walk around and admire, changes the aircraft's environment and therefore its context. So the aircraft itself becomes an event to which the visitor is invited to interpret. Now, regardless of how we choose to treat the paintwork, illuminate the aircraft, add supporting text to an aircraft display, or make any other curatorial intervention, the visitor has the final vote on how an aircraft is interpreted. Now, that interpretation all depends upon the particular association a visitor has with the aircraft. And for this, let me give you some personal examples. Sometimes an association with an aircraft might be purely aesthetic. For example, if I want to take a deck chair and sit in quiet contemplation of an aircraft on display at RAAF Museum, for me, my first choice would be in front of the SE-5A. Why? Well, not because it was flown by the Australian Flying Corps over the Western Front during the First World War, but because I happen to enjoy the aesthetic of that particular aircraft. I appreciate the woodwork of the propeller blade, the polished brass fittings in the cockpit, and the workmanship by the British engineers who built this amazing replica aircraft. Now, sometimes our association with aircraft is through family. Now, many visitors at RAAF Museum will walk past the aircraft display hangar without noticing the Catalina hull on the floor. Without its characteristic wings attached, the engines and its floats, it hardly looks like a Catalina. But for myself, the Catalina hull is the most personal artifact in the collection. Why? Because my father worked on Catalinas at Lake Boga during the war when he was in Air Force. So spending time in contemplation of the Catalina is an event which connects me with my father. Similarly, spending time in contemplation of the Caribou is an event which connects me with my best mate, who sadly passed away only a few months ago. So to me, the Caribou isn't just an aircraft, it's a memorial. Sometimes our association with aircraft is through our service. When the Black Hawk arrived at RAAF Museum just a few weeks ago, it immediately brought me back very fond memories of being deployed on operations in the Solomon Islands, where flying in a Black Hawk was a daily occurrence. Spending time in contemplation of the Black Hawk with my colleagues at RAAF Museum when it was being unloaded upon arrival just a few weeks ago became a storytelling event as we each shared our unique experience with that aircraft. The C-130H, on the other hand, reminds me of countless and uncomfortable hours I spent flying around as a passenger in the back of one as an airman musician. And honestly, I don't really appreciate the differences between an E model and an H model C-130 in our collection. From my perspective as an airman musician, I appreciate one as simply being a slightly less noisy variant of the other. Now, that's right. Now, other individuals and groups will interpret aircraft on display at RAAF Museum quite differently from how I do. But my point is this, that every visitor will interpret each aircraft according to their own unique association with the aircraft. So far, we've discussed just the selection, preparation, display, and interpretation of just a single aircraft. So what happens when we place two aircraft together in a museum? How is this new event interpreted? Well, with two aircraft, we tend to make comparisons of scale. If we were to place a C-130 alongside the Caribou, then we could begin to appreciate obvious differences in things like wingspan, tail height, and length. We might even appreciate the C-130 for its enormous and long-range airlift capability and the Caribou for its ability to conduct smaller airlift operations from shorter and softer airstrips. With two aircraft, we also tend to make comparisons of materials and technology. If we were to place the Avro Cadet and the Pilatus PC-9 together, then we'd appreciate the obvious differences of materials and technology between intermediate training aircraft from two different eras of Air Force pilot training. Placing two aircraft together from different eras also invites us to make comparisons across time. If we were to place a Bristol box kite over an F-111, then we would have an immediate and evocative juxtaposition of military air power from two eras decades apart. Now, this, by the way, is precisely what we intend to do in the foyer entrance to a future RAAF museum. But more on that in a moment. There are many other comparisons, of course, which can be drawn out between aircraft pairs. My point is this, though, that a pair of aircraft within a museum becomes a new event with a multiplicity of possible interpretations. So now that we've considered the comparisons which can be drawn between aircraft pairs, what happens when we place a group of three aircraft together into a museum? When we place three aircraft together, we create a higher level story as the grouping itself becomes a new event. For example, if we place the Canberra bomber, F-111 and FA-18 together, we see a greater story emerge about the evolution of Air Force strike aircraft and capabilities. Each aircraft retains its own meaning and provenance, and comparisons of scale, materials, and technology can still be made between aircraft pairs. But the dominant event is a new story about the role and evolution of Air Force strike aircraft. So a group of aircraft within a museum becomes a medium for thematic storytelling rather than each aircraft being the story themselves. So this is essentially what the new strike hangar display at RAAF Museum will be when it opens in July 2022. A thematic grouping of three amazing aircraft, each with their own unique provenance, with comparisons which can be made between each aircraft, which together tell a greater story about the evolution of Air Force strike aircraft and capabilities. But it's one thing to create a display around three aircraft within the relatively small confines of a Second World War era Bellman hangar. But how do these concepts translate onto a much larger scale? In other words, what might a future RAAF museum look like in 2025 with over 70 aircraft plus 30 vehicles and over 100,000 smaller artifacts for display? Well, the way in which the thematic grouping of the Canberra bomber, F-111 and FA-18 are being presented to tell a greater story about Air Force within the new strike hangar is a proof of concept for the thematic approach being taken throughout RAAF Museum 2025. So let's now explore the kinds of stories that we could tell about Air Force through the grouping of some of the other 70 aircraft from the National Air Force Heritage Collection at Point Cook. If we were to group the RE-8, the Sopwith Camel and Sopwith Snipe, then we have Flying for the Empire, a story about the Australian Flying Corps and volunteer contributions during the First World War, and about appreciating the danger, bravery, and prestige of the early aviators. If we group the Avro Cadet, DH-60 Gypsy Moth, and the Hawker Demon, then we have Formation of an Air Force, a story about the critical role of RAAF Base Point Cook played in Air Force development, and about the rapid expansion of aviation post-First World War. If we group Sabres, F-4 Phantom, HS-748, Mirage, Vampire, Meteor, and Mustang together, then we have Air to Air, a story about the development of Air Force combat capabilities and about RAAF's involvement in Korea and Malaya in the context of Cold War. If we group the Pilatus PC-9, Windjill, CT-4, Mackie, and Cessna Bird Dog together, then we have Training, a story about the importance of training, about the aircraft associated with training over time. If we group the Caribou, C-130H, Black Hawk, and Iroquois, then we have Global Assistance, a story about Middle East operations and about RAAF's role in global peacekeeping and aid. And so on and so forth. Maritime, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, empire to nation, joint force, strike, origins of flight, space, and future. Now, with so many possible stories and so many themes emerging from so many aircraft, we can divide these stories and themes into two broader groups, which each tell a greater story about Air Force and Air Force history. The first group, Building Our Nation, tells a greater story about the commitment, risk-taking, and innovative spirit of the Royal Australian Air Force, which played such a critical role in building our modern nation. During the First World War, the small and scrappy Australian Flying Corps flew for the Commonwealth, looking to Britain for guidance, expertise, and leadership. After the interwar period of experimentation and training, Air Force expanded into a large and sophisticated force during the Second World War. Stepping out from behind the shadow of Britain, Australia assumed a new and distinct global identity. The second group, Shaping Our Future, reflects Air Force personnel standing on the edge of the unknown, anticipating, responding, and reacting, making decisions that shape the future of our nation and our place in the world. Air Force personnel show up in times of national, regional, and global disaster, collaborating with defence partners and allies to ensure the ongoing peace and prosperity of our nation. Now, if we consider each of these broader groups to be a wing within a museum complex, and if we add a central hub for facilities and operations, and we add archive and storage areas, then from those stories, a conceptual design for a new RAAF museum begins to emerge. Now, we could take a very different approach and simply line the aircraft up in chronological order. This would be a spectacular display to walk through, but it would simply tell the story of the evolution of military aviation in Australia and little else. Alternatively, we could group the aircraft into capability types. This too would be a spectacular display to walk through, but it would simply describe the story of the evolution of Air Force capabilities and little else. A cheaper option would be to build a climate-controlled environment for smaller aircraft only and place the larger aircraft on an outdoor undercover hardstand. Exposing large aircraft to weather elements would subject them to surface degradation, and the large aircraft displayed outdoors would become large but simple props segregated from the museum itself. The RAAF Museum 2025 concept will consolidate all of the static display aircraft from the smallest Jindovic through to the largest P3 Orion in the collection into a single indoor display location to protect all assets from weather elements and to create a consistent, coherent display and thematic approach. At its present site, the scale of the RAAF Museum displays is confined to what aircraft can be configured and displayed within the extant Bellman hangars dispersed among the RAAF Museum precinct of RAAF Base Point Cook. With RAAF Museum 2025, we have no such limitation. The size of RAAF Museum 2025 display hangars will be determined by the number and size of the aircraft that we wish to display. Now, I'm not announcing today that Air Force is building a new museum for 2025. RAAF Museum 2025 represents, at least at this point in time, a concept only. But without a concept, we have no means of communicating a vision. So what exactly is this new vision of the new RAAF Museum? With over 100 aircraft and large items in the collection, some aircraft being the only in existence in Australia, the new RAAF Museum will be a world-class attraction and cultural destination for local and international tourists. A dynamic, immersive, and breathtaking experience, the new RAAF Museum will harness emotive storytelling, multimedia effects, and theatrical lighting to enhance its extraordinary collection and to engage the visitor. RAAF Museum 2025 will be a national destination for the Australian community to deeply engage with Air Force and its history, and an important place for Air Force personnel to connect with their service. RAAF Museum 2025 is envisaged to be located on the northwest corner and beyond the security perimeter of RAAF Base Point Cook. This will make the museum more accessible to visitors and tourists and remove the liability and impost of base security access arrangements. RAAF Museum 2025 will consolidate the museum visitor experience, storage areas, and maintenance and restoration areas into a single museum footprint. This will cease the ad hoc growth of the present RAAF Museum precinct, which was achieved through the long-term adaptation of heritage buildings to accommodate a growing collection. Most importantly, RAAF Museum 2025 will be an Air Force, not an aircraft museum. Through the display of aircraft and artifacts, RAAF Museum 2025 will tell the story of Air Force personnel whose lives intersected with the aircraft and whose decisions and actions shaped what Air Force is today. More broadly, RAAF Museum 2025 will tell the story of Air Force and how its history has shaped the lives of all in the community. Every Australian has a connection to Air Force. So tonight I've spoken about pivoting RAAF Museum staff and operations toward the display of static display aircraft and artifacts. I've described the RAAF Museum interim redevelopment project, which includes the new strike and aircraft display hangars opening in July 2022. I've outlined some of the challenges with operating a publicly accessible museum from inside the wire. And I've hypothesized about what an aircraft means when it goes on display, about how an aircraft is interpreted by visitors, and how stories and meanings which emerge once aircraft are grouped thematically. I've described the thematic approach being taken for the concept of RAAF Museum 2025, and I've described what RAAF Museum 2025 might look like on the ground. RAAF Museum houses Australia's and most important collection of military aircraft, along with an extraordinary collection of artifacts. In order to protect and preserve the history for future generations and ensure all Australians have access to the story of Air Force, RAAF Museum 2025 will create a new accessible visitor experience for all Australians outside the wire. RAAF Museum 2025 will not be an aircraft museum. It will be an Air Force museum, Australia's Air Force Museum. This is the new vision for RAAF Museum. But what is the story which emerges from this new vision for RAAF Museum? As we hypothesized earlier, the visitor has the final vote on how the RAAF Museum itself will be interpreted. But for what it's worth, I'll conclude by offering my own view of the story which emerges upon my own reflections with the RAAF Museum 2025 concept. While service chiefs have guided Air Force from one era to the next, there is no chief of chiefs guiding a bigger picture. There is no master strategist and no master engineer. RAAF Museum 2025 reveals Air Force to be a story about people. Air Force is a story about service chiefs, pilots, engineers, technicians, logisticians, and support staff who have applied and evolved the available technology and resources of the day in order to address the immediate operational challenges and emerging strategic situations which they faced. In my view, the story of Air Force, which emerges from the RAAF Museum 2025 concept, is a story about remarkable people, and often unremarkable people, all doing remarkable things. being innovative with the technology available to them in their time, applying it to the circumstances which they face to deliver air power for Australia's interests and security. The RAAF Museum 2025 concept, in my mind, paints a truly inspiring image of the museum as a living representation of the Air Force we've been proud of, the Air Force we are, and the Air Force we want to become. Thank you very much. Now, I am happy to take any questions with noting the caveats at the beginning of the presentation, although it was suggested that I've note that there's people in the room that are probably more familiar with the RAAF Museum than myself. So I should probably use this forum to ask you questions. But for what it's worth, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Pass the microphone to the questioner.
Enjoyed your talk immensely. Thank you very much. Learned a lot about the museum tonight. Haven't been there for a while, and I'm looking forward to your developments. What I did notice is one of your graphics, the Liberator.
Yep.
Are we talking Werribee Liberator?
We're talking conceptual Liberator. So one of the big tasks which we have with the RAAF Museum 2025 concept is not just to look at how we display aircraft within the collection, but it's also to examine what the gaps are in the collection. And once we begin to understand where those gaps are, we'll go back to Air Force and we'll put strategies in place about how we fill those gaps. We don't have a plan, a concept, or an intent, but that's a good example of a gap that we know of in the collection. We might be in a position to fill it in the future. We might not, but part of RAAF Museum 2025 concept is putting everything on the table.
Last question. Has funding been allocated for the buildings of the new museum?
For the present redevelopment?
No, the 2025 one, the L-shaped building, northwest corner.
No, so RAAF Museum 2025 is a concept only.
At this stage, yeah.
At this stage only. So we haven't put it forward as a plan. It's merely a vision from our end of what we think a new RAAF museum might look like. And more importantly, taking a very organic approach, looking at all the aircraft in the collection. If we're serious about displaying the aircraft we have in the collection, about considering the gaps that we have in the collection, then it doesn't make sense to only have part of that story on display. Yep. If our mandate is to tell the entire history of Air Force, so the expressions we put in terms of those graphics, in terms of a plan, is just a representation of following that train of thought to what a future RAAF museum might look like.
Oh, it looks good. Well done.
Thank you.
Matt, I should perhaps follow on to that last question. Obviously, these are government facilities. And so for a large investment such as this, it's going to have to go through parliamentary works committees, etc. So the money will be sought through official government processes and defence processes. So I just want to make that understanding that there are limitations and constraints that we have to go through because this is a government facility. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Matt, in your graphic, you showed a Neptune bomber on the left-hand side. Does that exist at Point Cook? I mean, you used to have two. I think one has gone to Haas, I believe. I'm not sure.
There's there is a Neptune in the collection, which is shed, well, not shed, but intended for restoration at some future date. Yes.
Very interesting talk. On looking at Museum 2025, you've got some rather iconic buildings on the base. Are they still part of the 2025 vision to be relocated adjacent to the proposed facility, or will that be a separate area?
So the thinking at the moment, noting that this is just a concept, it's a representation of a vision. It's not a plan. It's not anything we've put forward. It's not anything which we're seeking to fund today. All those decisions will follow. What we envisage is a heritage precinct on the northwest corner of Point Cook, which would consolidate a RAAF Museum precinct outside the wire, along with a heritage walk along the western perimeter, where we can put some of the heritage buildings that are at Point Cook and make them accessible to the public. One of the significant issues we have at RAAF Base Point Cook, of course, with any kind of redevelopment, is protection of heritage. So there are a number of ways which we're looking base-wide to incorporate that. Some of that is adaptive reuse of the heritage buildings at Point Cook, and others is, of course, relocating some of those buildings to the Northwest Precinct, where they can be incorporated within the RAAF Museum precinct as part of a heritage walk.
As a separate comment, some of the illustrations make the displays look rather sterile. Without the appropriate vehicles, ground support equipment, uniforms, other displays around them, and interpretive materials, the aircraft on their own won't stand up. That's an observation from myself.
I totally agree. So within the graphics, they are intended to. You're talking about the strike and aircraft display hangers from earlier in the presentation. So they're a graphic of which were prepared to look at how the aircraft could be lit within those spaces. So within the broader plan, there are display cases, in fact, a large number of display cases. There are interactive elements as well. There are walls with content and information about people. There are artifacts, there's GSC, there are engines, there's things which accompany the strike aircraft, all of which will be on display. So it'll be a very, very rich environment. Despite what was in the pictures, it won't just be the aircraft sitting in a hangar.
Thank you for the discussion tonight or presentation, Dion Makovsky. I'm just asking, following on from the last question or last questions regarding the actual the premises or the property at Point Cook. You've got the museum currently located at the most iconic airbase in Australia, and it does sound like in the future there's going to be very limited access to it. Would there ever be a plan for like guided tours or anything by appointment, that kind of thing, so that people who are interested can still see some of that base, that particularly the southern tarmac, those kind of iconic areas?
Yeah, so it's interesting to say that, because we're having conversations around that point today, and the conversation today was in the context of school groups. You know, if we bring what we can't do with the secure RAAF base is have people deciding to, you know, wander off and go and have a look at the parade ground, and it's a shame we've got this, you know, Air Force Memorial with there's other heritage things which will be amazing for people to see, but with the new base access arrangements, they just won't have access to those areas. So it was spoken about in the context of school groups that we could bring, you know, as part of the RAAF Museum visit to take people around the base and have a look at some of these areas. And that came from, or the nucleus of that idea came from a pilots reunion which happened on base just early this week, where it was just that. They were able to visit the base, have a look at the parade ground, the new memorial, the chapel, and then come back to the RAAF Museum precinct, get out and have a look through the museum, have a look at the development, and even have a look through the working hangars at 100 Squadron. So all those opportunities are up for grabs, and we think we will have, in terms of RAAF Museum 2025, we'll have to be very, very creative in how we facilitate people's, I almost say, rightful access to a heritage site. You know, it is a secure defence base, but it's got so much provenance, not just for Air Force, but for all Australians. So yes, we'll look at ways and means of achieving access. It just won't be through self-guided tours of individuals.
That may relate. We've got a bunch of questions in the chat on the screen here. That might relate to one of the questions that Roland Yarn has asked, and particularly as you point out the 100 Squadron operation. So Roland's interested, how is the future museum connected to the flying display area for the interactive displays?
Yep, and that's a really good question, and it's a very, very topical question. So there is a lot of discussion around this particular point. So RAAF Museum no longer owns the flying element. So when we reopened the museum, we're focusing initially on the base visitor access arrangements, bring visitors through the static display precinct, and then escorting them off base. when we projected probably by the time we get to January next year, we'll be able to introduce a flying element again. I don't imagine that will be quite to the extent of the interactive flying displays which have been offered in the past. What we've floated around as in terms of the concept is having a flying display twice a week, once during the week, once weekdays and once on weekends to cater for two different demographics. But for people who haven't been on Point Cook for a while, one of the problems we have is that the whole airside, there is now a fence segregating the base from airside, which means we need to now escort visitors through to airside. So there's complexities now with operating those events. So they will happen. They just won't happen on day one of reopening. We expect they'll happen by January 2023.
Great. Roland, I hope that answered the question. And let me scroll up, Matthew, because I think there are a couple of questions further up. Oops. Was that question? Oh, okay. No, the rest of them look like they're comments about how they're wonderful dreams. Any other questions in the room? Or on the okay, so it looks like Dennis, was that a question from you? Oh, and if you're online, you'll need to unmute yourself because we've muted everyone. So
yeah, just a couple of quick questions. Has anybody been to Hendon when you've been looking at your concept, Hendon in London, that the RAF's display? Secondly, the Battle of Britain on their display up in Lincolnshire is probably worth visiting because there you're sharing with an operational RAAF base. And notice no mention about Bomber Command representation. Did I miss something or? So
absolutely not. So Bomber Command is most definitely.
You didn't talk about anything from Bomber Command. How are they going to represent it? What sort of representation are they going to have?
Well, Bomber Command is part of the reopening RAAF Museum now. So we have a new Bomber Command display, which is being installed presently. I was upstairs in the Heritage Gallery today, and it's one of the primary jobs of our curator, exhibition curator, to develop that display. And there's a number of ways and means. We can, as I kind of spoke about in terms of the thematics, we can group this up in different ways. We can talk about separate commands. We can talk about separate capabilities. We can talk about aircraft groups. So we're not necessarily kind of, I guess, settled on how we might put these thematics together. We might decide to make a discrete Bomber Command, or it might be integrated as part of some of the other thematics that I spoke to. Now, in terms of other areas that we've looked at, one of the primary exemplars we've looked at is New Zealand, and yes, we most certainly have looked at the UK as well. But more broadly, rather than take an element from New Zealand and an element from the UK and an element from some of our own museums, what we're trying to do is build a ground-up approach, which is a homogenous kind of idea rather than a handful of sporadic ideas. So we're using that as our initial starting point. Although when it comes to actually designing the exhibitions themselves, we might go a little bit more specifically about drawing some inspiration from places like New Zealand and the places you mentioned as well.
Okay, thanks.
Michael Smith had a question. Michael, you'll need to unmute yourself. Thanks.
Indeed, I have. G'day, fantastic presentation. I'm actually really excited by what you're just proposing for 2022. It sounds wonderful. And I share your love of the Catalina. One of the things that I've loved doing and have taken other friends is you used to be able to apply to fly in a small plane, to land and sort of taxi up to the museum and come in. Is that something that will be able to be offered in the future?
I won't say no, but all I would say is it will be much more difficult to achieve in the future than it was in the past. The airbase, the RAAF base Point Cook, is an operational airfield. Even though the heritage aircraft have transferred to 100 Squadron, 100 Squadron are an operational unit. So they share the airbase with RMIT. Plus we have other areas like Army, for example, using the airfield from time to time. So we did have one visit who was doing some work at the museum who we sought approval for to fly in. That was achieved by exception, I guess, and because he had particular business to do at the museum. But I imagine that as the base security protocols increase over time, that will become more and more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, what I kind of really hope that you could think about in your planning is to have it, because there was a really good system where there was just a standard form to fill out specifically for that purpose. And if you could include it in your thinking, there's, it's been something a lot of people, when they're sort of on around Australia rallies or flying clubs or whatever, it's just been a wonderful way to come. And I mean, I learned to fly at Point Cook and was a member of the Point Cook Flying Club for many years. It was obviously sad that got asked to leave, but I understand the reasons. But I mean, when you talk about people being able to come in, if there could be a system for it, and you could try to work towards what that is, there'd be a lot of people who'd love to arrive that way.
So we've actually looked at this very, very broadly. And, one of the, even flying aside, one of the problems we have on the Point Cook site is even public transport onto the base. So that's going to have to be something which we flesh out once we get further into planning. When the museum was open back in the day, the museum used to almost own the airfield, because the only people who were operating from the airfield were the museum. So RAAF Museum had much more greater influence in what the flying activities could be allowed. That's changed significantly now, and I think it'll be harder in the future. But I guess to demonstrate how broadly we're looking at this, we also looked at whether, rather than building a new RAAF museum on the northwest corner that's accessible via road outside the wire, could we put the new RAAF museum on the southern area so that visitors could arrive via ferry and connect that with the ferry terminals around Melbourne and stuff. So everything is on the table in terms of what could be explored. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's not likely to happen. But in terms of creative ways about bringing people in, including flying, everything's on the table.
Michael, perhaps I could, from a strategic perspective from Air Force, and I know for many years, having been to Point Cook many years across my career, Point Cook was dying a very, very slow death. The realisation now is that Point Cook does have an operational purpose for the Air Force, or for defence. I can't go into the details. However, because of that, the base will continue to live. I think this is the problem. It is very hard to find that compromise between the open access and actually having it for a purpose. And I think this compromise is something that Matt and his successors will actually need to resolve in future. But I think the key point is we're trying to find a way in which we can make it more accessible to the public from where it is at the moment. And that's the vision, and I'm sure they'll be able to find out some compromises. So that question is RAAF resuming active operations on the base? It's probably better to say Defence will be doing operations from the base, correct, Matt?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we'll leave it there. That's probably the best I can put it, but it means that the base does have another security posture, probably greater than it was when it was officer training school and all the other things that used to occur on that base, put it that way.
Okay, there's a question from Daryl Purdom. Daryl has his hand up there.
Yes, and I think I'm off mute already.
Yes, we can hear you, Daryl. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm from the RAAF Heritage Centre at Amberley. So I've seen some of the background in our context, but not in your context. So it's a very polished presentation, but I've had time to think about some of the contrary views that people might express. So my questions are going to be about some of those. One is the criticisms of people who come to see aeroplanes, not theatre or a show, or a light show or a theatre, a performance. That's one of the criticisms that was levelled at G for George in its previous display in the rather extensive bombing mission, the simulated bombing mission. But I've seen it in other contexts. And the other one is how to engage with the broader family. you know, groups come through there, their mum and the kids and the little girl who aren't particularly interested in your stories or your aeroplanes. But the key to that issue in the past has been interactive displays, things that people can touch and do and play. So, you know, have you got that type of element in your future plans? And the last part is looking at 2025. Sorry, it looks like very similar to what we're seeing in proposals for Amberley, which is to cram the maximum number of aeroplanes into the smallest space you possibly can. Now, I say that seriously. You have a look at the plan and look at the Dakota in the corner. You can't see it, the DC-3. It's got 2 or 3 aeroplanes in front of it, and it's jammed in a corner where, you know, because of the size of the building, you can't see it. We have people who want to walk around the whole aeroplane. All right, so
I'll just before there's more questions, I'll just those 3. First of all, in the latter, because it's one precious in my mind, there real estate and money is a finite resource. We're creating a display to put 70 aircraft on display, creating a footprint where people are going to be able to walk around every aircraft is just not feasible. Creating a museum where people are going to be able to walk through into the cockpit, into the back of every aircraft is just not feasible. So what we're aiming for with RAAF Museum 2025 is a balance where some aircraft will be accessible from all sides, some will be accessible from the front, some will be accessible into the aircraft themselves. If we were to create a museum to put 70 aircraft on display, including the P3 Orion, and have accessible circulation around that, we probably need a footprint bigger than RAAF-based Point Cook itself. So I guess that's the first point. I acknowledge what you're saying, but there is a balance to be made. Secondly, in relation to the interactive elements, so with the displays which we're building presently, every single aircraft will have, for example, interactive touchscreen. So as well as being able to look at the aircraft, interpret them themselves, there'll be an interpretation panel with a whole bunch of facts about it. Plus then people can drill into and do their own research, look at some more video content and stuff around each of the aircraft should they wish. So it should cater from anyone to someone who wants to have a casual walk past through someone who wants to know how many rivets are running down the side.
Yeah,
now, in terms of other interactive elements, in terms of the present precinct, we are bound by the confines of the present Bellman hangars, which means we can't put things like simulators in display. If we did, it would have to be at the expense of some of the aircraft. So we're really struggling for real estate in the present precinct, which is why we think a concept like RAAF Museum 2025, whether it be the one that I presented today or some different iteration, really has to be an inevitability. And your first question about the theatre element, well, presently it is not a show which is going to be running continuously. So when people come into the strike hangar, over the course of a day, there'll be a 10-minute element where they'll be able to see the show around it, which is being constructed around the strike hangar. There'll be a 10-minute moment where people can see the element around the Canberra bomb, and a 10-minute element where they can see the F-111 display. In amongst the rest of the time, it is house lighting, and people can just appreciate the aircraft as they wish. So there should be opportunity for people to make the choice whether they want to sit in quiet contemplation of these things or be there at a particular time and get the more immersive experience. So we're trying to cater for the biggest breadth of people we can, from families, from people who have never seen an aircraft museum before, through to Air Force and aircraft aficionados who really want to explore the detail. And the reason why we're going down this lighting path is so that those details can be seen, because presently in the hangars, with just the hangar bay lighting, you just can't really see those details. So I hope that answers your question.
It's a response. I'd rather sit in a room and discuss some of these things in the context of the plan and my experience with museums around the world as well. I think the first part, when you're talking about your immediate plans in the facilities you've got, the the strike arrangements with the F-18, which of course is the hero aeroplane.
To some people. To others, the fact that we're taking the Phantom off display is an absolute travesty.
Well, that's the other part of it, is that when you're telling a story, of course, to some percentage of visitors, you're not telling the right story. Oops, I haven't lost you. No. Yes, that's the other criticism. You're telling a story, but it's not the right story. So, but that's going to be a certain person's point of view. That's a challenge. And we like to address that by ensuring that there's a guide there, somebody that they can talk to. So again, it's not just about a bland presentation that you tell them. Having live people in there means they can tell you, and they quite often a visitor gets the maximum enjoyment out of the place by actually telling his story to somebody.
So we do have host office as well.
That's actually one of the
no,
questions.
that's just I'm a volunteer. That's a plug for volunteers being an integral part of any of these museums.
That's one of our questions. That's one of our questions coming up as well. And sorry, I've had to scroll up. Judy Rainsford has typed a question in here. I think partly relating to the interactivity as well.
Yep.
It's tough, isn't it? You show a concept and everybody thinks it's a plan. So I guess it's
Concept, yes.
different to make sure that we all understand this is a concept that can get discussed, not a plan of what the new building will be. But Judy's question is that museums used to display opportunities to learn the history of aircraft and artifacts. Since the new concepts are all about stories, imagination, and creative writing, how do visitors, and in particular children, learn the history? So Judy's question is, how do the visitors learn the history?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. So I emphasized a lot about storytelling, but the storytelling is what's implicit in the way we place aircraft throughout a display. It's not our intention to ram any kind of story down people's throats, or to shape history in any particular way. We're inviting people to learn about aircraft, learn about Air Force through the aircraft. So there's a couple of elements to this. One is that in terms of schools, then yes, we will absolutely have, and this is for by the time we reopen the museum, and certainly for 2025 concepts, have dedicated schools programs where they get guided through and are taught about Air Force history. More broadly, though, one of the challenges that we have with reopening the museum, which is escalated further with RAAF Museum 2025, is we now need to have more host officers and volunteers on site than we had in the past. So the museum before used to have caged walkways and enclosed things which separated people from the aircraft, which means we didn't have people in the hangars to supervise them, to stop them from getting too close. We've now got, in most instances, no more than a thin piece of tensor wire at knee height, separating an individual from an aircraft, which means we have to have host officers on site to kind of supervise that activity. Their dual role, though, is to be on hand to answer any questions, or to indeed provide some personal perspectives around some of these things. The other element as well, in terms of why we're not kind of ramming any particular story down people's throat, is that the footage that we're taking to accompany each of these aircraft are perspectives of people who have flown these aircraft, including, for example, Chief of Air Force, Mel Hupfield, who flew the very FA-18 that's arriving at the museum in our, he's being filmed as part of the show. Now, he's not speaking as Chief of the Air Force, talking about capability. He's talking about his perspective as a pilot, talking about the flight characteristics of this particular FA-18 and what it was like to fly this in various conditions overseas. So I guess we're telling these kind of stories. We're not, I guess, ramming a particular historical line down people's throat, except for the school groups, where they'll be given a guided tour, and in amongst the visitor access systems, we will offer guided tours where if people want to be taken by a host officer through the entire display and learn something very, very specific about the history of Air Force, they can do so.
Great. Now, I think you might have already answered or gone close to answering Roland's question. and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to scroll down again so I can see it. But Roland's question was relating to volunteers. Is there a role for volunteers as qualified guides and other museum roles, e.g. archive research assistants?
Great question. So presently, taking the RAAF Museum past constructs, we've generally had host volunteers, we've had tech volunteers, and there's been a couple of researchers which we no longer have, because we don't really have a RAAF Museum doesn't really have a research capability. We support research which History and Heritage branch is conducting, but we kind of just house some of the materials. So what we're looking at now in terms of planning for RAAF Museum to 2025 concepts is what kind of host offices do we need? So in terms of RAAF Museum 2025, what you probably didn't see in the detail is the opportunities for theatrettes of events within the aircraft displays themselves, of classrooms, of research rooms, which are connected to the History and Heritage branch research centres. All these kind of opportunities exist. Now, I don't imagine if RAAF Museum 2025 gets legs that Air Force are going to give me any more people to operate it than I have now, which means I'm going to have even a greater reliance upon volunteers than I do now. So one of the things which we're doing for RAAF Museum for the reopening this year is to provide baseline training to all host officer volunteers so that they all have a baseline understanding of everything which is inside the display. Coupled with that, we need to provide training on things like security management, emergency management, and first aid. These will also be roles of the volunteers under the guidance of Commonwealth officer. Research will be undertaken by History and Heritage branch, and I'm sure that the branch would welcome volunteer researchers assisting with their work. As I said, we just kind of manage the materials down in Melbourne. Restoration and maintenance will always be a part of RAAF Museum. Perhaps not to the extent it was in the past. These days, we're tending to look to more hybrid solutions and contracted solutions, and leveraging off the restoration team in Amberley, who have a large body of Air Force restorers. So what a volunteer means in the RAAF Museum in the future is going to be very, very different. So to that end, we're about to recruit an APS 5 volunteer coordinator whose sole role is going to help us to grow the volunteer base from around about 80 through to about 120. That's to manage the present RAAF Museum footprint. And then as RAAF Museum 2025 concepts evolve into a plan, we then need to look at how we're going to staff that. And I think initially that's probably going to be looking toward our volunteers to fill those roles.
Now, Dave had a question here, and I'll again scroll this down.
You partly answered the question I was going to ask. I'll ask it anyway. Do you propose to cater for serious researchers? Like, for instance, if I wanted to research an aircraft and I know you've got material there, photographs or whatever, will you cater for someone like me to go down there into an office or to your facility, which is really separate to the museum display area, to do serious research? Will that be catered for?
It will be catered for, but not necessarily by RAAF Museum. So the research capability will come through History and Heritage branch. Now, this is noting that the Air Force Museum has only been under History and Heritage branch for some not even 8 to 18 months. What we imagine, and this is again just conceptual, is that because we have a large repository of items at Point Cook, which relate predominantly to the history of Point Cook, we'd look at ways and means of linking that library of materials to the broader collection of materials held by History and Heritage branch in Canberra and the other heritage centres. So conceptually, I'd like to think that a researcher who's coming in doing research approved by History and Heritage branch could potentially conduct that research from Melbourne, looking at materials in Melbourne and accessing remotely, materials held at other sites, just as they would access a Canberra site or a Heritage Centre site and access RAAF Museum materials remotely. So one of the large projects we have at the moment is the digitisation of the Air Force Imagery Archive. And following on from that, all of the books, materials, photographs, and things that we've got held at Point Cook, so that we can make that stuff accessible to people, perhaps even without having to visit the RAAF Museum site.
And I can see Group Captain Fredericks has his hand up there. He might
I'm
have a
sure he
comment.
does.
Yeah. So look, this actually steps into the bigger branch, noting the RAAF Museum is part of the branch. The vision is that we will be trying to bring all these elements together in terms of a full collection. Now, a vision is, excuse me, not COVID. The vision is that there will be an element of it in Melbourne. We'll have an element in Canberra. We'll have bits in the heritage centres. We hope to be able to connect them all up so we can share all the electronically. In terms of researchers, we have a vision. We want to make our collections accessible to the public. Now, that does create some complications in terms of the access, but we're going to work through these. So this collection, even though it's housed at the RAAF Museum, it will be part of the branch. So the view will be you'll contact the branch, and if you wish to go and see our collection, we'll try to make it accessible to you. There will be layers of accessibility as well. We're thinking about having dedicated researchers versus the family historian who's going to go scrounging through and trying to find stuff. In terms of the imagery collection, yes, there are 6.5 million photos in our collection at Point Cook. Only 3 million have a electronic form. The other 3.5 million date back to 1920s, and we are currently starting a project. We have a pilot program going at the moment to digitise those, but that's only half the solution. I need to digitise them and make them accessible to the public. I want all of you to be able to get the imagery we have, as long as it's not of dead bodies or classified material, to be able to reach in and use it. And our vision is to not have you charge you. So whereas you can get that photo from the War Memorial for 200, we might be able to give it to you free of charge, because we want you to use the information we have so you can tell our story. So it's a force multiplier effect. We will invest in you to help us tell our story. So Roland, I suppose the answer to your question is yes, we want to make you accessible. To take to the last question about volunteers, yes, I have 6.5 million images down there at Point Cook. We're going to have to cull through those and remove a number of those, which we obviously can't release to the public. But once we've done that, I want to get people to come in and help us identify the metadata. And it may be through us putting images online and saying, help, can you tell me what this is? And we can then, and this is following, so the social engineering approach, which is a bit like what the New Zealanders are following, and we bow our heads to our Kiwi brethren because they're so far ahead of us on this. I want to make that imagery accessible to you. I want to make all the records accessible to you. If a lot of the records we have, why am I holding them? I want to get them into the NLA or the NAA and let them share them as well. So our vision is, we just celebrated our centenary. If we can't keep promoting our history, our last 100 years, then when's a better time to do it? Does that answer some of those questions?
Fredo, I think that's a great point at which to wrap up the questions, because we're still getting a lot more questions coming through, and we're not going to be able to answer all of them, or else we'll be here till midnight. So I'm just going to hand back to Dave Prosser, our president, and he'll wrap up and thank Mathew.
Derek, thank you. And it's been a very good evening, and I, for one, have enjoyed hearing about the current and future prospects of the museum, and also a good thank you to the History and Heritage branch for making tonight accessible and arranging it all. And Anna Williams, I do thank you very much for your help tonight. My big thank you here, of course, goes to Wing Commander Mathew Shelley, for a great talk and excellent speaker. Thank you, Mathew, I do appreciate it. The other thing is that I thought that the museum, be it current or future, is not only an educational exercise, but it's also showing the taxpayer where his dollar is going, past, present and future. And I also think it's an excellent recruiting tool as well. My thoughts are that anyone wants to potentially join the Air Force, they should be walked through the museum to see the past, present, and potentially the future as well. So Matthew, I do thank you very much for being a speaker tonight. Excellent talk. You've generated a lot of comment here. And from that, I do thank you immensely.
That's a great pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
I'll just close off. If you'd like to have a cup of tea and Bicky over here. Thank you all for being here tonight, and hope you have enjoyed the evening as well.
And thanks to everyone who attended on Zoom. We're just going to close off the Zoom meeting at this point.
Yep, good to have all those people there on Zoom. Good to see you folks here, and look forward to seeing you in a month's time. Okay, good night then.
Thanks, Matthew. Good night.
Just a little bit of milk here. Thank you.
Well done, Matt.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Not bad for a musician.